Hi, it's wonderful to have you all here, even virtually, at the Abate Historical Society. Instead of being with you today, I'm in my spare room, but it's fantastic to be able to share with you some wonderful information about the National Museum's Scotland Collections Review of ancient Egyptian material across Scotland. First of all, my name is Dr. Dan Potter. I'm an assistant curator of ancient Mediterranean collections at NMS, but I'm an Egyptologist by training, which is where I come into this project. Now, on the right there, you see Scotland with dots all across the country, and each one of those is a collection which has ancient Egyptian material in it, and we'll come to some of them as we go through. Now, this project started really with a touring exhibition with Discovering Ancient Egypt, as it's called, which focuses on three notable Scottish individuals who were formative in the development of Egyptology. So upon Alexander Henry Rhind, one of the first truly scientific archaeologists to excavate in Egypt, the Astronomer Royal for Scotland, Charles Pittsie Smyth, who did a lot of research at the Great Pyramid of Giza, and Arni Abernethy Piri Quibell, who was an artist who spent decades in the field illustrating sites and finds. Now, the tour is still ongoing, but to be able to share some of the other stories from the rest of the country, we're also able to make some videos, which if you go onto the NMS YouTube site, you'll be able to find them there, which include one about the Reverend Colin Campbell in Dundee, and also his really exceptional facsimile tomb paintings in the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow. As I said, the tour is still ongoing. It's currently in the John Gray Centre in Haddington, with a tentative finish date in April there, but we'll see what happens with the world all with new restrictions, etc. So, on to the actual collections review. It really stems from a very simple question. What Egyptian objects are in Scottish museums? And we are not the first people to ask this question. If we jump back over a century, we find with the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland that a gift of £40 per annum enabled a massive museum survey across Scotland to be undertaken. Now, dozens and dozens of museums in this report are mentioned, describing exactly what's in each collection, but Egypt doesn't really feature too much. We have 14 instances of Egyptian material being mentioned, and really most of those are in reference to mummified remains, either animal or human. In the preceding time then, we come then to another attempt to do so. The Association for Curators of Collections of Egypt and Sudan conducted a review which identified around 18,000 objects in 16 collections in Scotland. And if you look at the map on the right there, you'll notice that the islands at the top of Scotland are completely missing. So Stromness, the collection that is, you may have noted on the first slide, wasn't even recognised at that point. So we came into quite a big task, really, to improve upon the information that we already had. So with the help of the National Lottery Heritage Fund and the Museums Association Esme Fairbairn Collections Fund, we're able to work with around 28 collections spread across over 50 sites. I personally was able to visit 8 individual authorities and go through all of their collection thanks to the generosity of their time and information. I examined hundreds of objects in person and recorded thousands of objects remotely as well, leading us to the result that we have here today. The Ancient Egyptian Collections in Scottish Museums report. It collates around 14,000 objects, varying greatly from the smallest collection, which is at Linlithgow Heritage Trust, which has 2 objects, to the large collection in National Museum Scotland, where we care for over 6,000 ancient Egyptian objects. It's the greatest detail that we've gathered so far about such Scottish collections, including most detailed information about donors, about the archaeological sites represented in the excavations, which were the sources of the objects. Given my sort of submersion in all of these collections, we're also able to identify a number of connections between collections and identify as well future directions for possible research so that we can all continue working together. So the numbers are really nice. Obviously, numbers are great, but what I really want to share with you this evening, or this morning, this afternoon, whatever time you're watching, are some of the stories of the objects and some of the stories behind their collecting histories, their provenance, and their donors. So most of these stories start with a scene not too dissimilar to these. This is my visit to Montrose Museum, where I got to look at all sorts of wonderful objects. And it's almost like a bit like Antiques Roadshow, except solely Egyptian, give or take a few objects. But it's even better as well, because nobody's trying to sell them. Nobody's looking for valuation. People just want to know a bit more about the objects. So we could be able to tell you about the statue that I'm looking on the left, or the shabti on the right, and the little stela that I'm using a torch to be able to read a little bit better. And then once I'd visited, I could go away and spend some time researching, trying to improve the information that we had. From this work, I was able to identify a number of new collections, new broadly. These are collections that just hadn't been fully examined previously. So from Aberdeen in the north, down to collections that are essentially right on the doorstep of National Museum Scotland where I work, such as the Anatomical Museum or the Vere Gordon Child Collection at the University of Edinburgh. From these collections, we got a great variety of objects, from this wonderful pre-dynastic, so that's around, you're looking at about 3000 BC, pot that's shaped like a bird at the top left-hand corner there, that's up in Aberdeenshire. It's sadly lost its head on the left, but this is often the case with these pots. A wonderful, beautiful painted sherd of pottery in the centre there, which I found out about in the collections in Forres about a week before finishing the project, so it was a real fantastic element. A shabti down in the bottom middle there, the dark green one in Fife, another shabti in Linlithgow, and all the way to things like Greek papyri, which have most often come to be part of university library collections. We can really redraw the map of Egyptian material in Scotland. As I said before, we can extend the map way north now to Stromness, our most northern objects and the most northern Egyptian objects in the UK. These small figures were designed to assist the deceased in work in the afterlife, and these were inscribed for an overseer in the Temple of Amun-Ra. Sadly, not being able to tell quite what their name is, perhaps Kenna, something around that direction, because despite my wishes, I wasn't really able to justify a visit all the way up to Stromness to look at three objects. But once I can travel again, that might be a good reason if I needed any other reason to visit Stromness. So for the rest of the stories, I'm going to try and stick to the region of your interest, to Abertay. So I'm going to start here in Perth with the Museum and Art Gallery. Now, as I was looking at collections across the country, you start to see patterns in who collected objects and why. And in Perth, we have two very different types of collector. The first is the tourist. Now, here we have a wonderful image of the very famous and now no longer active Shepherd's Hotel in Cairo, really at the height of colonial travelling. This image is from the Thomas Cook archives. And within the collections in Perth, we have this really rather wonderful scarab, very small, about that sort of size, and inscribed with the name Menkeper Ra. Tuthmose III. And this is a lovely object in and of itself. But what it is accompanied by is this letter, a handwritten letter by an Egyptian man called Mansour, who is working at the Shepherd's Hotel in Cairo, and essentially writes out a description for the owner of this scarab about what scarabs mean in ancient Egyptian culture, how to read the hieroglyphs that are written on it, and recounts the tale. So it gives us a perfect idea of where this object was collected. It was collected by the previous owner in Zagazig, which is just north of Cairo into the Delta, which is the fanning area of green heading towards the Mediterranean Sea. Whilst we can have this wonderful bit of detail for the scarab, sometimes our collecting is not always that clear. Perth also represents a very large element of military collecting, because when people were in Egypt for any reason, it was an unusual occurrence, and people wanted to take something back, a souvenir, no matter how small, to remind them of this visit. And within the collections in Perth, we have several objects that can be attributed to some brothers, the Riach brothers, namely Lieutenant William Andrew Riach of the 79th Regiment of Foot, the Cameron Highlanders, and Dr. James Pringle Riach of the East India Company. Now, on the right there, we have William's dress coat, which is a simply fantastic remnant of this man's life. Now, he had a rather eventful time in the Napoleonic Wars, being injured quite considerably at the Battle of Quatre Bras, to the point where he is then given sick leave. But at some point in his time of collecting and travelling with the army, he collected this, the funerary cone of the King of Thebes, Montuemhat, who's shown on the right. Now, I say that, for those of you who can read hieroglyphs, there's a little bit of a helper rather than the actual object above. But he trust me, it says Montuemhat on the top, on the bottom line rather, and it describes him as the mayor of the town of Thebes. But he was so powerful that the Assyrian rulers who came to rule over Thebes decided instead to note him as the King of Thebes. Now, a funerary cone is a moderately common collector's item within museum collections, but it's not always clear for the visitor what they did. Thankfully, we can look back to ancient Egyptian sources and look above this tomb and see the row of dots across the top there, which each of them is a funerary cone. We can even go back to the site. This is the tomb of Montuemhat, where this funerary cone would have originated. It's one of the most spectacular and largest tombs in Egypt. It's not clear whether Riach purchased the object or collected it directly from site, or what happened there. All we know, what we can piece together, is that it is William Riach, and from an Egyptological point of view, the site that it came from. If we look across to his brother, though, we move instead towards Persepolis, the amazing city site in the centre of Iran. And he left his own marker there. This is up on the one of the gates, part of the city which was built by Darius. You see there J.P. Riach Esquire and other members of his company. So this is somewhere high up on one of those archways there. Now, he was also collecting. At some point, he must have been in Egypt, because he later donated this object to Perth Museum. Is a hieroglyphic inscription, which, given what's remaining of the hieroglyphs, it was probably a hymn to the sun. On the left, we have asking iterations about being able to see. And this is very common of sun hymns. It's a very bright blue, but the blue is actually a much more modern application. We can tell this by looking at the sides, where blue also, having been in the hieroglyphs and the decorative borderlines, does also leak out over the side or even with a fingerprint. While collecting objects like this, he also collected this rather wonderful object, which is a little bit blurry, I'm afraid, but is a wonderful object and one of very few that I actually found during my travels and surveys in Scotland. What I've called an altered papyrus. This is because it's actually a piece of wood where you have some blank and some other slight chunks of inscribed papyrus wrapped around the piece of wood to sell. Now, if we travel a little bit up from Perth, we can then head up to Montrose. Wonderful museum and one of the venues for the tour that had been there. It was fantastic to be in Montrose for a while, but before we even got the exhibition there, I was able to look at a number of objects and really enhance the information that everyone has about them. Here we have a stela, so a monument made by the family or the individual to commemorate a member of the family. This particular member of the family is the gentleman seated on the left, sniffing the flower, and his name, which is just written to the right of him, above his face, is Teku. And it's quite a standard formula at the bottom that describes funerary offerings to him. But these inscriptions and his name had not been read before, likely hadn't been read since at least it had entered the collection. And if no one could read hieroglyphs then, because there's no indication in the records of Montrose Museum that anyone had ever read his name, it was just noted as a stone stela with seated man. It's possible that no one had read his name in thousands of years. So it's a real privilege to be able to add that extra information and give back his name to him. Alongside Teku, also had the distinct enjoyment of working with this lady. Now, before going to Montrose, we had some idea that there was a statue there, but the description that we had of the statue was quite vague. It was described as a statue from Thebes, which is more than some examples you might get in records, but at the same time isn't 100% useful. Thebes really is a huge metropolis in modern day Luxor that was active for thousands of years. So it could be a statue of any time, any material, any size. It could be this big, it could be gigantic. We had no idea until we got to go to Montrose. And from the research that I've conducted since, I think we can add a little bit more information to it. It's a really beautiful statue, unique really of its kind. It dates to around 250 BC, give or take, which is the Ptolemaic period in ancient Egyptian history. So this is the period of time after the Alexandrian conquest, where he leaves his general Ptolemy in charge of the country. So this is the family that will eventually, in a little while after the time of this person's life, give birth to Cleopatra, number 7, the famous one, sort of Liz Taylor one that you think of. This material, some of the features that are included in her statue have no parallels from this period of time. Completely, the combination is unique. And on the back, we're helpfully given a really detailed hieroglyphic inscription that caused me more than 2 or 3 wondrous times trying to work out what it said, but also provided lots of information for reconstructing her family, which I'll come to in just a moment. In terms of the donor, also I've been able to do quite a bit of research about them. The donor is noted quite clearly as Dr. James Burns. He could be most famous for being Robert Burns' first cousin twice removed. Essentially, there are two parts of the Burns family, one that stay over in the area of Montrose, and the other which go towards Ayrshire. Now, James Burns is a fascinating man for more than one reason, but I'm going to try and stick to the time that I've got to try and tell you as much as possible. So I will come back to him as and when. Now, having him as the donor is very interesting, but he could have acquired the statue at any time. He could have purchased it in London, for example. But the acquisition register said that he brought it from Egypt. So now was the time to try and find his journey. And thanks to his very detailed descriptions that were then published in the local paper in Montrose, can now reconstruct his journey back to Scotland from Egypt. And not only from Egypt, but from India, where he was based as a doctor working for the East India Company. He had this rather fantastic voyage coming from Bhuj, where he was stationed in what is now the border between Pakistan and India, down to Mumbai, across the sea, up the Red Sea, through Egypt, across the Mediterranean, and back to Scotland eventually. And this is the first time really this has ever been charted. It really was one of the very first passenger journeys that would cross they called it the overland route, which seems counterintuitive given how much blue my red line runs through. But what they really meant was overland across Egypt from the Red Sea. The other option, which his brother, the famous explorer Sir Alexander Burns, took to get back towards where he was posted in Afghanistan, was under the Horn of Africa. So really great addition to our understanding, not only of the acquisition of the statue, but also of the history of travel. So moving back to the statue though, I could then spend my time making something that looks like this. This is the tidy looking version of the inscription on the reverse of the statue. Now, you'll see a lot of grey blobs there. That's because there's quite a bit missing. Thankfully, though, there's enough there to give us a little hook into research. Namely, it provides us information that of the mother and father of the statue owner, a man called Usakons and a woman called Nehemis Ratawi. And when this statue had been noted previously in a sort of two-line note in a Egyptological catalogue source book, it questioned perhaps that it could represent Meraminyotes or Escon's two daughters. And that's really all you can get from the statue and a couple of other resources. But now, thanks to increases of digitization and the ability of more institutions to share material online, we can build a much bigger picture of the family of this statue owner. In fact, we can go 6 generations and include 19 members of the family. And there are the two individuals who this has the potential to be, Meraminyotes or Nescons. Down in generation 4, and we can jump all the way back up to her parents' generation, her grandparents, and right to her great-grandfather and great-grandmother. We can do this through a number of statues as well, so we can see the depictions of these individuals. Now, I said here that it could be Mera Mignotis or it could be Nes Khons. This is the perennial difficulty of academia, in that sometimes you have to sort of stay a little bit balanced. My feeling is still that I think you could probably push more for Mera Mignotis as the identity of the statue owner, purely based upon the titles which she's given. Namely, she's given the title of a sistrum player and musician of Amun-Ra. So she'd be working in a huge temple in ancient Thebes, modern Luxor, as part of the music. Nes Khons, her sister, however, never has these titles. So I'm slightly leaning towards Mera Mignotis, but all of those gaps mean that we've got to sort of have some slight balance. But nevertheless, if it is Mera Mignotis, I wanted to share with you one other object, which is now today in the collections of the Allard Pearson Museum in the Netherlands. This pair of funerary papyrus sandals, which also describe the exact same parents, Nehemes Retawi and Usakons, and the sistrum player Mera Mignotis. A wonderful potential physical connection to the burial of the individual that the statue could represent. Not only do we have these wonderful international connections between Montrose, Cairo, Turin, London, Glasgow, and the Netherlands, but also Cairo, obviously. But we also have connections in the people that I've already been talking about, namely James Burns and James Pringle Riach, both of whom are doctors, both of whom are working for the East India Company, and indeed both are members of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai. When I found this, I was so surprised to find them next to each other in the listings, because the listing doesn't seem to have any particular order in terms of alphabetization. But as well, I later found that there is some evidence that they were also correspondents with each other. So corresponding between what was then Persia and India. Not particularly got any of the correspondence to show you, but there is lots of talk of them being these corresponding friends almost. So the world is a small place. In other ways that the world is a small place, I can also show you a number of broad trends that I was able to identify of collections across Scotland. The first of which is linked through this gentleman here, King Seti I, a king during the New Kingdom of ancient Egyptian history, who's represented in all of these places that have got the little red lines heading towards themselves from up in Forres, down into Perth, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dumfries. Now, the objects that link him are all related to his tomb, which was found fairly on in the modern development of Egyptology. Particularly, they're related to these shabtis. Now, Seti has a lot of shabtis made for himself, mostly in wood covered in resin. So when I went to Dumfries and saw these two, I immediately recognised them. And not only recognise them there, but recognise them in other collections as well. It would be fascinating to see how many of these are now around the world, because he had hundreds made for them, and it was never clear where they all went. As I mentioned before, when I talked about the collection in Perth and the letter from Mansour explaining the scarab, the tourist market was a massive element of collecting in Scotland, not just in one place either. The objects brought back from tourists and travellers as souvenirs were often gifted to museums, and these are spread out across the country. One of the most interesting elements of this tourist market that I've come across are these modern shabtis. Now, Ito have looked at a fair few shabtis and be a little bit familiar with them, but when you find these, it's quite clear that they're not all that they appear to be. Now, one of the key features for them is that in the centre of their chest, each of them around about here have Cartouche, a royal name of Menkaure, the Thutmose III that we also encountered on the scarab collected by the visitor to the Shepherd's Hotel. Now, these shabtis don't look as they should look for a shabti of Thutmose III's reign, which should look something like this. Should look pretty nice if it was a royal shabti. It should look blue, sparkling, shiny, nice files. Instead, they're varying colour, often quite dull, and made out of a mixture of plaster in some cases and baked clay in others. From one of the examples that I've seen, it appears that they were burnt over a fire to give them the blackened texture. Instead of looking like this, we also find not only them, but other varieties of them. Varieties that look like the god Osiris on the left-hand side. Ones that are shown in what Egyptologists often call daily dress. So the one second from the right there, wearing an ancient Egyptian kilt, because Scotland does not have the domination of the kilt. Ancient Egypt is also a big kilt-wearing society. Less plaid, though, and more clean white linen. But all of these, on the surface, if you have one in a collection or two, might not stir any suspicion. But as you see more and more of them and recognise that they were probably made in a mould, they become even more interesting. Indeed, as I researched a little further, I found an example here on the left from a book from the early 20th century by a man called Wakeling, who was really took it upon himself to find all of the what he called fakes and forgeries, to warn any potential visitors. Now, now that you've seen these shabtis, you can also then look at other examples like these scarabs with sphinx heads and see really some of the same material, some of the same design qualities. And they also have hieroglyphic inscriptions that take on the same name, take on the same Menkaure name, or other royal names and royal iconography. Now, one of the things that we did during the review was really talk about these differently as being modern products rather than fakes and forgeries. Because whilst they're not ancient objects, they're still important objects that tell us about how we have encountered and understood ancient Egypt. Namely, they were all produced to catch someone's eye. And no doubt they're eye-catching. No doubt they're interesting. No doubt they're good-looking. And as well, they're small enough to carry home with you as well. So I really like to think of them differently, to think of them as tourist art. The same way that today, I know I've done it on the way back from Cairo airport. I've bought tourist art, namely art produced purely for tourist sales there. And these are no different. I was also able to make connections between specific archaeologists. One of the most unusual stories in the distribution of Egyptian material is that of John Garstang, who's shown rather rakishly leaning on his photographic backdrop on the right-hand side. He was an archaeologist based in the University of Liverpool, and following a season or two in Beni Hassan in Middle Egypt, he found himself with excess as he saw it. At this time, what was agreed with the Egyptian authorities was that a selection of objects were retained for Egypt and their museums and their collections, and the rest could go back with the excavator. So following his return to the UK, he had too much of the things that his backers were not interested in, namely pottery, which is a terrible aspersion on ceramics, and every ceramicist will be very upset with him. But instead of disposing of this non-collectible material, he instead put a letter in the Times offering from the excavations selections of ceramics to public museums or other educational institutes, all of which must not charge entry fee. And loads of people took it up, as you saw from the red lines, including people like these gentlemen here. This is the Hawick Archaeological Society, a fantastically posed photo of them all looking very erudite. But we could then go back and look at these ceramics and treat them with the respect that the ceramics deserved, unlike John, sadly, and look at their unique features, look at their shape, their material, and also the numbers that are written on them that describe which precise tomb they came from, to be able to reconstruct the burials that they came from, to talk about the people who owned them and the people they were buried with, rather than just them as some extra ceramics to be spread about. I was able to uncover the beginnings of stories of other people. If you'd like to find more about this gentleman, Dr. James Grant Bay, we made a wonderful video with the team up in Aberdeen that's also on the NMS YouTube. But Grant Bay, as he's known in Egyptology, went to Egypt to help with a cholera epidemic. He was given the title Bey, which is the equivalent to a knighthood in this country. So he's essentially Sir James Grant for Egypt. But he also became a fantastically prolific collector and cataloguer. Following his death, a lot of the objects that he had collected became part of other collections, were sold, and were spread across the country. So other than Aberdeen, where he donated a lot of his collection, we're also able to find objects of his collection in Perth and Dumfries, where they're all beautifully labelled, usually in his handwriting, and all mounted upon the same card, namely the descriptions of his sanatorium. This is essentially a very, very early sort of spa culture, mixed with a little bit of medical care. A sanitarium, different from a sanitarium, but all on this same paper. And I'm sure there's more to be told about his story that still is there to come out, because his collection was essentially used as a reference point for everyone starting in Egypt. And finally, on to Amelia Blandford Edwards. Now, as a successful writer, Amelia had travelled to Egypt and become enthralled with the area, with the history, with the culture, everything, and decided to set up what was then called the Egypt Exploration Fund, which would fund research and archaeology in the country. It's still active today, and you can still be a member, and they still hold the values, some of the values that it was founded upon. To drum up the support for her society, which people would then pay some money towards, and that would then pay for the excavations, she conducted a tour of lectures across Scotland, and most frequently left something behind, left a souvenir of the time. Now, this example here is in National Museum Scotland, but is very representative of the examples that we see in the other collections, where it describes what the object is, where it came from, who it was excavated by, and that was presented by Amelia Edwards. For some of the places, this worked, and local societies, museums continue to support the Egypt Exploration Society. Others, it might not have worked as well as she'd hoped. Now, with all of these stories, we've been able to start teasing at some of the threads that connect all of these collections. And these are just a snapshot of some of those that connect donors and excavation sites and objects to each other across Scotland, and not just across Scotland, but then across the world. This really is the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's available now in terms of knowledge. I'm really pleased as well with what we've been able to accomplish in terms of some legacy for this project. Shortly after publishing the review online, which is free, open access as a PDF for anyone in the world to download, had emails popping in every day, adding new information, adding extra things, adding corrections, being able to open up these collections more to people across the world, not just in Scotland. As well, several museums, so in Hawick, Dumfries and Perth, Montrose, this project, being able to share extra information, being able to share training, knowledge, being able to sit down and read hieroglyphs has been a real impetus for new work as well. Hawick has made a new permanent display of Egyptian material, their first in many decades. In Perth, we had an extension to the tour and had extra material from the collection shown. Really excellent results. I mean, Dumfries photographed and recorded every single one of their objects in really excellent quality. So what I'd like to leave you with is not just the idea that all this information is being gathered, but this information is being used. This information will continue to be used and will continue to be available. And hopefully with more work and more time, we can make more connections and tell more stories, because there are a lot out there. And with that, I'll thank you all very much for listening. It's been a pleasure talking to you, even remotely, via the screen. Hopefully one day I'll get to come up and meet you all in person. But with that, thank you all very much. I look forward to hearing from you.